Before you can move on to the exercise for this chapter, or exercises rather, I need to explain to you something that I skipped in the presentation that you just watched, hopefully. And that is that there is a function called input that we need to use in order to get interaction from the user. Currently, we've only told the computer what the value of the miles driven and gallons used, for example, already are. So we tell it that the miles driven are 294 instead of just using the number 294. We tell it that gallons used is 10.5, and then we perform this mathematical function, which is just that miles per gallon is equal to miles driven divided by gallons used. We need to have the user of the program actually be the one that gives us this information. And in order to do that, the function that we need to learn is called input. I'll give you a link to the input page on W3 Schools. It's a very simple command. We already learned print. This will display a message. Input, on the other hand, will actually stop and prompt the user for input, for some response to be given. In this case, for example, it's going to be how many miles were driven and how many gallons were used. Any response given by the user will be then given that value to the variables that we're using. So I expect the computer to ask me how many miles were driven, and I would give it 294, and then this operation would take place basically on its own. I'll give you a link to the W3 Schools with Python input function. Basically, I already said we print the question, then we ask, what it is, what variable we want to be affected by this. Then we can do other things such as printing a message, or in the case of this sample, perform math functions. All of these actions and the input function are explained in your textbook on pages 22, 23, and 24. Those are the pages that I skipped because they give samples based on a different kind of IDE, a different kind of development environment than the one that we're using in this class. It shows what the Python shell would do on a Windows machine. This is REPL that we're using, and this will work on any machine. So to get started real quick, I already mentioned that input will take the input from the user and give that value to a variable. And since our variables are a little bit beyond just X, I'm going to come back to the code and start to type in the sample on page 23. We already have this miles driven is equal to 294. Instead, we're going to say that, well, we don't want to give this information in the program. We want to input the user's response, and I'll have input then flash a message that says, in quotes, since this is a string, enter miles driven. I'll put a space there at the end so it doesn't get all mashed up. 10.5 I will replace with a similar input, and the message will be enter gallons used. So this will then prompt a couple of questions: enter miles given, and input the enter gallons used. The math will be pretty much the same. MPG is equal miles driven divided by gallons used. However, we will have to make some changes as Python has changed in the last few years to be more specific about the way it handles certain variables. So I have the math, I have the print. Let me run and show you what errors might arise. We know that we wanted 294 and 10.5 gallons, 10.5. And now here's the error. It tells me that the type of error is that unsupported operand types for str and str, so it's not liking the strings too much. This error is explained in your textbook in page 24, actually, and 23, both of those pages, 23 and 24. And the reason is that unfortunately when we give numbers as an input to Python, it doesn't treat them as numbers, it treats them instead as strings. As discussed in class before, strings and numbers are not the same. Numbers can do math, strings can display messages, can get that type of information, but it's not easy to do math. At some point we tried to add a couple of these variables and ended up, if we added 20 plus 20, we got the result as 2020 because it was not doing any math. Instead it was concatenating, it was putting strings together. It just said 20 plus 20 must be 2020 instead of 40. The way to do this is to be a little bit more specific with the data types that we're using, and there will be more discussion about data types later in the course. For now, know that since we know that 10.5, for example, has, it's not a whole number, it's not an integer. This is what we call a floating number. It's got little parts of a number after it, and when we do the math, we might expect to have a remainder that Python is not counting on to get just yet. We call this a floating number. So when we make the question, how many gallons were used or how many miles were driven, we need to be more specific, rather, that we want the input to be a floating number. So we can do that by just adding the word float before the input. I'll type in the parentheses to include not just the input word, but also the message, all the way to the ending parentheses. So it would be float, the word, or rather the function input, parentheses, then the input action with the message, a closing parentheses, and then an additional floating parentheses. Now these numbers will be treated as such, as numbers as opposed to just strings, so that MPG can compute this operation. Let me test this to see that I'm actually not just making it up. I'll type in my 294, the 10.5, and now it gives me the result that we've been expecting, which is 28. Now these numbers, miles driven and gallons used, are put in variables that can handle the numbers that we're looking for. Now we're just saying 28.0 as a result for this test. When we tell the program to give us the result, we can give a little message here in print and just tell us what the total of the miles were. That is, that the message should be print, open parentheses, and inside open up a quote and say the message, not enter, but rather the miles per gallon, colon. And I'm not going to put a space because I'm going to use a comma right after this quote. Miles per gallon, comma, MPG. I'll run the program again. Try to do the same math. 194 miles driven and 10.5 gallons used. And we get the result that miles per gallon is 18.48, rather 18.47, etc., etc., etc. Just a long series of numbers. We'll be dealing with more data type options later, so that when we get a result like this, we can round it up to two numbers, after the dot, and that should be coming up in the next couple of chapters. The results that we have now is this is our first test of how to do a calculator. The problems that you are responsible for deal with 3 separate programs, or rather 3 separate problems. This is just a sample to show you how to use input. In the next video, I'll show you how to do part A of your lab for your assignment for chapter 2.